If you're a Gen Xer, you probably remember this decade as your teen or young adult years. If you're a Gen Zer, you probably don't remember this decade at all because the oldest of you were babies. But if you're a Gen Yer, Gen Yer? If you're a millennial like myself, you remember this as the decade you grew up in. This is the 1990s. In the era before smart devices, or frankly even useful internet, a typical American 1990s childhood consisted almost entirely of physical and tactile experiences. Some things about the kid life weren't much different back then. We rode bikes, we played sports, we played with toys, and we watched shows and movies. However, some activities were completely different before smart technology came along and changed the way we experienced them. I entered kindergarten in 1992. Yes, I'm that old. As an elementary school student in 1992, a weekday began with being awakened by your parents, which in my case was a single mom living in my grandmother's house in the countryside of Vacaville, California. Like other parents at the time, my mom likely woke up via an alarm clock that required the correct time to be initially entered manually. And since power outages have always been a thing, you could tell whenever you came home to this blinking clock that the power likely went out sometime when you were away, forcing you to reset all of the clocks in the house using the hopefully correct time on a watch that you hopefully had, because that was the only widespread portable device that kept time. If you didn't have a watch handy, then the last option was to go to the phone attached to the wall with a cord and dial popcorn, which gave you this.
Good evening. At the tone, Pacific Daylight Time will be 7:54 and 10 seconds.
After the daily morning routine of reluctantly getting ready for school, my mom drove me and my Barney backpack in what I vaguely remember being a charcoal-colored manual transmission Hyundai Coupe that was probably made sometime in the 1980s since we definitely did not have new car money. The moment the car engine revved up, the radio may have played this,
Times the snow comes down in June.
Or this. And in case you're wondering, this is a picture of a cassette car stereo. By the 1990s, many cars already had CD stereos, but my mom's collection of music was mostly on cassettes, so naturally the car had a cassette player. Because I haven't stepped foot in a grade school classroom since I graduated high school in 2005, I'm not able to get into the technological differences between a 1990s classroom and a 2020s classroom except for maybe this one. In my grade school days, whenever the teacher showed us a movie, the teacher would need to first reserve an AV cart from the school's audio-visual room. Then sometime during the day, an AV technician would wheel the cart into the classroom equipped with a television and a VCR for VHS tapes. One day after school, I went to a friend's house where he introduced me to this wonderful machine that enabled him to control the images on the screen. This would change the rest of my childhood. This, of course, is when kindergarten Raymond is supposed to beg his mom for his own Nintendo, and I will continue that storyline in the video game chapter. Before getting introduced to this new world of electronic entertainment, all I had ever been exposed to were the 8 Sacramento area channels that came through on my grandma's 1970s looking television. Channels 3, 10, and 13 were pretty boring to my child self because they always had talk shows followed by the news. When I came home from school, I could count on my grandma and mom having one of these talk shows on in the living room.
Saying life has not been, you and I have a lot in common. Life.
How, Susan, does your family feel about it?
After 5-year-old Raymond agonized through that first hour of talk shows, my grandma and mom added another hour.
Michael Jordan came face to face with the king of pop, Michael Jackson, but first.
And the torture didn't end there. The hour between talk shows and dinner looked like this.
And now, News 10 at 6.
Channel 64 was boring because it was basically the infomercial channel. Channel 6 was boring because it was a combination of public access and stuff for little kids. Remember that Barney backpack? This is the channel that played Barney. And yes, I briefly enjoyed Barney, and I'm going to need you to hold still for a second. I'm pretty sure Channel 6 also featured Lamb Chop along with his famous song that you can use to piss off anyone without fail.
Just because this is the song that doesn't end. Yes, it goes on and on, my friend.
That's enough, guys.
Some people started singing it, not knowing what it was.
Anyway, Channel 40 is where the magic happened. New episodes of The Simpsons were on Fox 40 every Sunday night at 8 during the TV season, and reruns were on Channel 58 year-round. Who would have thought that when I first began watching this show in 1992, when it was already a few years old, that the show would still be on air well over 30 years later as of the making of this video? The cultural impact of The Simpsons during its peak can't be overstated, which is why I'm giving this show more attention than I will any other show from the 90s. It was a combination of stories that made the characters lovable with joke writing that was appreciated by both kids and adults. Seasons 3 through 8 produced some of the best episodes of television during the decade. I assume that The Simpsons resonated with such a broad audience because it gave a sobering critique of American culture couched in humor, and it was part of the dysfunctional family revolution that took over 90s television following the Cosby Show era of the air-quote ideal family. Because honestly, a typical 90s family probably identified more with The Simpsons than whatever archetype old heads at the time saw as the ideal family.
Well, let me tell you something. We are going to keep on trying to strengthen the American family to make American families a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like the Simpsons.
Achieving a level of success no cartoon had since the Flintstones while not being directed entirely towards children opened up the floodgates for other edgier cartoons that appeared throughout the decade. I didn't grow up with cable, as you probably already figured out by the 8 channels our TV's antenna could detect without self-destructing, so I never watched Beavis and Butthead or South Park as a kid. But enough kids at school spoke positively about the shows for me to miraculously convince my mom to take me to see the movies. Because somehow the producers of those shows were able to crank out movies within a few years of their small screen inceptions, whereas The Simpsons made us wait until well after the end of its cultural relevance despite the fan base begging for a movie in the 90s. But I digress. At the beginning of first grade, my mom moved the two of us out of my grandma's house and into a duplex in the next town over, which 6-year-old Raymond was obviously thrilled by. Our home had a single 1980s looking TV that got the same 8 channels my grandma's TV got, but on an even smaller screen. Yay! And the TV didn't have a remote. My after-school experience during the mid-90s was based on whether or not my mom felt like watching the TV, because between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m., we did not share the same taste. If my mom was watching the TV had 2 hours of this.
That if they didn't lose weight, you were out of there.
Pauline, are you saying if she left Stacy tomorrow, everything would be great with you and your daughter?
I would be the happiest woman.
If I was watching the TV often looked like this.
It's morphin' time! Dragon Sword! Mastodon!
Pterodactyl!
Triceratops!
Saber-tooth tiger!
Tyrannosaurus!
You're in for a scare.
If I went to my babysitter's house after school, their TV religiously had 30 minutes of this. Often followed by 30 minutes of this. Those of us who grew up in the decade before social media knew that our elders were not going to miss the local news, which usually came on at 5 p.m. and again at 6 p.m. But 5 o'clock was also the beginning of evening sitcom time. This is where you'd catch classics like the show that transformed a rapper into one of Hollywood's biggest actors due to his ability to range from goofy...
This is all your fault, Will!
...to being serious.
How come you don't want me, man?
If you grew up in the 1990s, you might remember this being considered a fun thing to do on a Friday night.
It's Friday night, and the mood is right. We're gonna have some fun, show you how it's done, TGIF.
TGIF had lineups of ABC sitcoms throughout the decade that included one about a young couple whose unusually easy dating life duped boys like me into believing love is possible for all of us. Another that was supposed to be about family, as the show's name would suggest, before getting hijacked just 4 episodes into the first season by a character whose charisma completely overshadowed the rest of the cast. And a show that made all of us want a talking cat. There were more TGIF shows such as the aforementioned Full House and Step by Step, but that's all I can remember from my childhood without looking up the rest. Outside of the TGIF lineup, but still prime time, I will give honorable mentions to Moesha and America's Funniest Home Videos, the latter of which is the prehistoric version of every eye-roll inducing video that appears on your social media feed today. And let's not forget... And...
This is Jeopardy!
Pat Sajak, Vanna White, and Alex Trebek, even back in the 90s, had each already felt like longtime hosts of their respective game shows. Sure, it's probably not the most grueling line of work, but I have to respect the longevity. I could say the same about the late-night talk show hosts at the time, but they were on past my bedtime, so Child Raymond produced few memories of them. Now let's move from nighttime to morning. I'll begin with what you likely saw on TV as a 90s kid who stayed home from school on a school day.
Baloney!
Let's be honest, it was mostly a marathon of boring judge shows such as Judge Judy, Judge Joe Brown, Judge Mathis, and The People's Court. But there was one morning weekday show that actually made missing school worth it. I mean, aside from the inherent value of not being in school. But then there was that one morning every 7 days when corporations knew kids under the age of 14 would be home to be brainwashed by advertisements of dessert marketed as breakfast, liquid candy marketed as healthy drinks because a vitamin was added, and toys that never came with everything needed to make them fully usable.
Playproof dolls and batteries not included.
And the vehicle these corporations used to deliver these products into our young impressionable minds? Saturday morning cartoons. You had your Disney stuff like DuckTales, Gargoyles, Recess, Pepper Ann, and Doug. Not to mention all the Disney Renaissance movies that got their own TV series. Then there were the Fox Kids shows like X-Men the Animated Series, and Batman the Animated Series. And finally, the Warner Brothers shows like Animaniacs and Pinky and the Brain. Recess was the one that resonated with me the most because those elementary school tropes were especially relatable when watching as a grade school student. And I was semi-hooked on Brain's lifelong dream to take over the world. I was well aware of Nickelodeon at the time, but again, your boy grew up without cable, thus no Nickelodeon, which is why I can't talk about Rugrats or SpongeBob. Growing up on only network television might seem foreign to many of you. And I'll admit that growing up, I was jealous of those wealthy cable watchers who had access to entertaining shows 24/7. But I can't imagine the decision fatigue that comes with. Consider how long this TV section already is without including cable. And there are many other notable shows I failed to mention because I didn't watch them when they aired. The first four I'll mention are Seinfeld, Married with Children, Friends, and Everybody Loves Raymond. All of which I would eventually enjoy in the 2000s and 2010s via reruns and streaming services. The next four I'll mention are Saved by the Bell, Roseanne, The Nanny, and Frasier, none of which I've ever seen an entire episode from. And if I missed any 90s shows that were important to you, mention them in the comments to get the nostalgia party going. Back in the 90s, there was only one way to watch a TV show. Find a TV and turn it on. Simple enough. To watch a movie in the 90s, you could also find a TV and turn it on because some networks aired classic movies and you could always count on the usual holiday stuff in December. However, like today, if you wanted to watch a newly released movie, you had to go to the movie theater. Though obviously you couldn't use an app to order and reserve a seat ahead of time, you had to go up to the window and buy tickets the old-fashioned way. Back then, Vacaville had a short-lived theater called Galaxy 8 that operated from 1991 to 2003. That is where I saw the first movie I can remember seeing in theaters. It may not have been the most memorable movie of what was otherwise a memorable movie year, but Child Raymond somehow understood everything that was going on in the movie. The same could be said for Flintstones, which I still somehow have my original ticket stub for. However, Child Raymond did not understand anything going on during the 2.5 hours this was on the big screen, but years later grown-up Raymond would appreciate the filmmaking style of Pulp Fiction upon rewatch.
This is a tasty burger.
I don't know what it was about 1994 that compelled my mom to go on a movie theater binge that year, but if a decade was a box of chocolates, she certainly picked a good piece. And yes, we saw Forrest Gump in theaters. As great as Forrest Gump was, another movie stood head and shoulders above the others. Not just from that year, but from any year. Ever since the moment I saw that intro to The Lion King on the big screen, the movie has sat in the top spot on my list of all-time favorite movies. More than any other movie, this movie might be responsible for my interests in filmmaking and animation that led me to develop the art skills I would leverage to get into a reputable school that would eventually enable me to be a professional designer and amateur filmmaker. Because after seeing that movie 3 different times while it still played in theaters, I had to see everything else this studio created. Within my mom's home movie collection, I discovered 2 animated Disney classics, coincidentally both being 90s movies. Do you remember these plastic VHS cases? I think Disney knew what they were doing when they put their movies in these soft plastic cases because, 1, it provided better protection from us wild 90s kids, and 2, it somehow made them feel more collectible. As a kid, when your parents brought home a new Disney movie in one of these cases, you couldn't wait to take the outer plastic off, open the case, and smell the inside of the case with the VHS tape still inside like some sort of drug addict. Anyway, I'm guessing the rise of home video during the 80s and 90s contributed significantly to the Disney Renaissance era. Because when you popped one of these into your VCR, you got previews of movies that were coming out over the next year. Meaning, along with your parents bringing home a brand new home video of The Lion King being one of the best days of your childhood, that tape is also probably how you discovered the movie Disney thought was going to be an even bigger hit than The Lion King. It obviously wasn't, but it was still good enough to get us 90s kids to keep the chain going of dragging any grown-ups with money to the theaters to see the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And to give you an idea of just how prevalent Disney was in 90s pop culture, the decade produced a number of live-action classics that my after-school daycare basically used to babysit us. Which works because it's really the only easy way to round up 20 to 30 kids and keep them quiet and still in one place for 90 minutes. These classic live-action Disney films included Homeward Bound's 1 and 2, Jungle to Jungle, Air Bud, the Honey I Shrunk the Kid sequel, Honey I Blew Up the Kid, and the Mighty Ducks trilogy, off the top of my head. There were far more, but I listed the ones I saw. The sports section of the Supercut will illustrate the Mighty Ducks trilogy's impact on pop culture, but in the meantime, I need to mention another Disney live-action movie from the 1990s. The same year The Lion King came out, so did Angels in the Outfield. What a time to be a kid. This movie is probably the reason I'm a baseball fan. The wonderful thing that makes this such a 1990s movie is that it brought together stars who peaked in the 1980s with stars who would later peak in the 2000s. Fun fact, I was a crowd extra in this movie. Don't bother asking me where because I don't remember. All I remember is that my mom and I were paid in the form of large California Angels cups. Yes, the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim used to be called the California Angels. Another interesting fact is that the reason we were there for the filming at all is because the baseball scenes were filmed in Oakland, not Anaheim due to the Northridge earthquake earlier that year. And yes, the Oakland Coliseum used to look like that instead of this monstrosity.
The Oakland Coliseum, it got a rather infamous renovation back in 1996.
I don't like it. I used to be able to see the Oakland Hills. It used to be a beautiful stadium. Now it looks like a mess. I don't think it's going to look good when they finish it either.
Anyway, that's a lot of Disney stuff, so I can't imagine they'd have anything else, right?
It's a big one.
Walt Disney Pictures presents...
Oh, come on. So I guess now we have to talk about arguably the most successful studio ever. Yes, Pixar made its theatrical debut in 1995 with Toy Story, which not surprisingly produced some of the better movie toys of my childhood. In 1998, the studio released A Bug's Life, followed by Toy Story 2 in 1999. For the sake of not continuing this 90s movie section forever, I'm just going to briefly mention some other movies that stood out to me, and I'll leave it up to you to bring up any other movies that I didn't mention. I also have a couple of movie-related items to talk about before concluding this section. From my fuzzy movie memories of the early 1990s, some 1980s carryovers were still prominent in pop culture due to media having longer staying power in those days. For example, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Ghostbusters, and Back to the Future were still very popular movies when I was in kindergarten. Then in the first half of the 90s, there were a couple of Robin Williams movies, Hook and Mrs. Doubtfire. I also recall Jurassic Park and Beethoven from my early 90s zeitgeist memory. The summer of 95 thrilled grade school Raymond with the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie, and Batman Forever, the latter of which was Child Raymond's gateway to the rest of the Batman anthology.
Meow.
Speaking of series, the original Star Wars trilogy was re-released to theaters in 1997 for its 20th anniversary. And I can honestly say that the big screen being the first time I ever watched Star Wars definitely maximized the impact of that franchise's first impression on me. That same year, there was a movie about some boat or something that came out. Sure, I remember seeing it in theaters, but an even stronger memory is the theme song radio stations insisted on playing over and over and over and over again. And let's bring up Will Smith again, because he certainly had an impact on that era of Hollywood.
Welcome to Earth.
A few last random movies off the top of my head to mention before you all inevitably get angry at me for missing a few dozen obvious 90s movies. The Nightmare Before Christmas, which also produced some great toys. Free Willy, and Matilda. And yes, there were also some Jim Carrey and Bruce Willis films in there, but we need to finally move on. During the 90s before Rotten Tomatoes, if you wanted to get movie reviews before taking the leap of faith to go see or rent a movie, you usually relied on the reviews of the two most famous critics of the time, Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert. Together, they had a TV series called Siskel and Ebert where they'd banter back and forth and then give movies a thumbs up or thumbs down.
The story makes no sense. I feel for every family that's going to be suckered into seeing Home Alone 3.
Now, this is going to astound you, but I'm giving the movie thumbs up.
It does astound me. Are you okay?
Better than you were the day that you liked Starship Troopers.
Okay.
Then when you wanted to see a movie that was no longer playing in theaters, you had to go to a store with a movie section, a dedicated movie store, or a movie rental destination, usually Blockbuster. There's something about the Blockbuster experience that enriched the 1990s movie experience in a way that's impossible to feel now. Back then, finding the right movies was a fun scavenger hunt. I suppose streaming services are the modern digital version of that experience, but it will never be the same as physically walking down aisles. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some clouds to yell at. Yes, it's this picture again. I'm showing it because on this 6-year-old's birthday, he unboxed one of his most memorable presents courtesy of his great aunt. It looked like an even better version of what my kindergarten friend introduced me to the previous year. For those of you old enough to remember unboxing a brand new Super Nintendo, you may recall it usually including what many still claim is one of the greatest video games ever made. The music, graphics, and large map size of Super Mario World made it the perfect starter game that could occupy you for weeks or months without the need of nagging your parents for a new game. I don't know if this was the same for you other 90s kids, but for me, if I wanted to play video games, the TV had to be on either Channel 3 or Channel 4. So for the games that required Channel 4, while you were booting up your video game, you would get the noisy, scratchy ant thing that looked sort of like this because there was nothing on Channel 4. Anyway, Super Mario World was the Super Nintendo gateway to other Mario games, though I only recall having Super Mario All-Stars and Mario Paint. Other classics that got me through much of the first half of elementary school were Zelda and Street Fighter 2. Admittedly, I don't think I came close to beating Zelda. As for Street Fighter 2, there were a number of times I made it to M. Bison and lost before just giving it up completely. I'll give an honorable mention to Mortal Kombat due to its popularity, but I never owned the game. However, I occasionally played Mortal Kombat in arcades, which were definitely more of a thing in the 90s. But my go-to arcade game showed me the potential of sports simulations. Sure, it might have been missing a couple of notable superstars, but it had some of the most amusing commentary. I definitely got the Super Nintendo version of this. Other Super NES games I couldn't resist were the ones based on movies. And this probably wasn't great for my mental health because these were games that seemed nearly impossible to beat. In Aladdin, everything is fine until the Cave of Wonders level when trying to fly that magic carpet fast enough to not get engulfed by lava while being precise enough to avoid both the stalactites above you and the stalagmites below you. This is one of the many reasons why you don't bring monkeys with you anywhere. In the Lion King game, pathetically I don't remember even playing beyond the I just can't wait to be king level at the beginning of the game. And I don't recall ever getting past the first couple of levels in the Batman Forever game either. After 4 to 5 years of collecting fun but frustrating Super Nintendo games, the console was rapidly losing its relevance due to the emergence of new generation consoles. Especially the Nintendo 64, which I'll admit was released with a banger of a game that was a bit addicting. But the N64 and each of its games were way too expensive, so I headed over to Funko Land to trade in my Super Nintendo and all of my games for... If that original PlayStation intro took you back, how about demo discs? You know, the CD that enabled you to sample multiple games by allowing you to play a single level or small portions of different games. I bring up demo discs because that's all I was able to play for a bit before finally getting my first game because games cost money and I probably don't need to remind you again that I grew up without cable. Also, after years of Nintendo, I had to get used to this new concept of memory cards. Anyway, there were 4 PlayStation games I can remember from the late 90s portion of my childhood that define that era of my upbringing. Tomb Raider, NBA Live 98, MLB 99, and NFL Game Day 99. I played all of those with friends, but the only one I owned was NBA Live 98, which, just like the aforementioned NBA Jam, had at least one missing superstar. These were my preteen years, so the combination of Lara Croft and sports probably shouldn't surprise anyone.
Batting second, Derek Jeter.
Since I don't really have any additional commentary related to games I owned, for nostalgia's sake, I will shout out other gaming from the 90s I was familiar with even though I didn't personally own any of these. The first I'll mention are the Sega systems, the most notable ones being Sega Genesis, Sega Saturn, and of course the Sega Dreamcast sneaking into the decade late. Yes, the Genesis console was released in North America in 1989, but I remember this system being wildly popular at least into the mid-90s. Though I played the Dreamcast in the early 2000s, I never played any of these Sega systems in the 1990s, so the only thing I really knew about them is whatever I heard at school, and that they had Sonic the Hedgehog. Now let's talk about the games people brought to school. The notable ones my slightly aging brain can remember are Game Boy, Tamagotchi, and Pokemon. And yes, I know that 1 or 2 of those probably don't belong in the video game section, but this was the most logical place in the script to put them, and I didn't want to give this chapter a more generic name like 1990s gaming, because that would open up a can of worms that would force me to include countless other popular 90s games like Pogs, and I don't feel like doing that. Anyway, the original Game Boy that came out in 1989 seemed pretty popular when I was in elementary school. I recall the 1998 Game Boy Color coming out, but somehow I barely recall the 1996 Game Boy Pocket, which I guess, as the name suggests, is just a smaller version that's supposed to fit in your pocket, which I imagine wasn't that much of an issue when it comes to 1990s pockets. As for the Tamagotchi, these made fairly regular appearances around school during my elementary school years. I'm pretty sure I had a knockoff version, and I'm pretty sure I fed mine to death just like everyone else did to theirs. And for Pokemon, I'll admit I knew nothing about either the show or the cards, so when I saw kids at school showing off their cards to each other, it was like they were communicating in a foreign language to me. I'm sorry I don't have anything useful to say about Pokemon, so if you do, then I encourage you to write it in the comments because I guarantee you will be speaking someone's language, even if it's still completely foreign to me. Let's talk about the 1990s tech that wasn't covered in the first tech chapter. Before smartphones became our overlords, daily life consisted of tactile experiences that are now handled by those very smartphones. So I think an effective way I could explain 90s tech is to go through common smartphone apps and explain how we old people completed those tasks way back when years started with the number 1. Let's begin with app stores. The 90s version of an app store would just be a regular store. Or a mall, because malls weren't ghost towns back then. For example, today if you want to watch movies at home, you would just use an app store to download a media app and maybe buy a subscription to that service. If you wanted to watch movies at home in the 1990s, you needed to go to a brick and mortar store to buy or rent a VHS tape for each movie, buy a VCR to play the VHS, and buy a television to display the moving image. These could be found in big box stores like Walmart, which back then was spelled Wal-Mart. Or you could find these at electronic stores like Circuit City. If you wanted to play video games, obviously you needed either a personal computer or one of the dedicated gaming consoles I mentioned in the video game chapter since app stores didn't exist until the 2000s. When I first got exposed to computers in the early to mid 90s, let's just say they were not very advanced. My mom had an old computer with stacks of floppy disks next to it that I had no idea what they did, except for 2 MS-DOS games. The only one I can remember from those early childhood memories is Mixed Up Mother Goose, which looked and sounded like this. Oh, and to play MS-DOS games on our computer, you had to first type in a weird computer code. Because if your computer was old enough, then it probably didn't have a mouse. But my mom's friend's computer had a mouse along with this 1989 game called SimCity that I got a bit addicted to. Books apps have obvious 1990s equivalents. There was a library where you rented physical books made out of actual binding, paper, and ink. The library is a thing that's still around. Bookstores are also still around in independent form, but large chains have basically disappeared. Walking through the aisles of Walden Books, Borders, Barnes & Noble, and Crown Books to physically pick up books before you bought them was definitely baked into the 90s experience. Today, calculator apps make their 1990s ancestral versions feel about as obsolete as any item on this list, because the need for a calculator necessitated buying an entire separate machine with tactile buttons that did nothing but calculate numbers. The funny thing is that I was really into math growing up, and calculators to child me seemed like some of the most advanced technology available because it was a machine that could do in seconds what would take minutes or even hours for a human to do on a sheet of paper or a board. And the more advanced math you were doing, the more buttons with gibberish needed to be on your calculator. Oh, and those scientific calculators cost a ton. So a lot of 90s kids had parents coughing up hundreds of dollars for math classes that those kids could have just failed for free. Calendar apps as of today derive from paper calendars of the past. During my 1990s grade school days, usually us students carried around notebooks or notepads that had calendars printed on them so you could keep track of the days. In the 90s, it was common for most buildings to have paper calendars thumbtacked onto walls, and for those calendars to be themed where each month was represented by its own unique image within that theme. These calendars usually came with holiday labels printed on their respective days, but any other events or appointments had to be physically written directly onto the calendar in their respective date squares. Don't even get me started with the evolution of cameras. Of course, just about everyone in the developed world carries around a digital camera with impressive specs that just comes as a standard feature on the very do-it-all device we're talking about in this section. And content creators like myself carry around larger digital cameras to squeeze out just a little more quality than the average smartphone. But in the 90s, if you wanted to take a picture, you needed to carry around a camera with a roll of film inside that would capture the light burned onto its specially treated surface during the split second that a physical shutter on the camera opened to allow light in. These cameras usually had little wheels on them you would slide to advance the film so you could take the next picture. Once you used up all of your film, you had to drop it off at a local store where the photo department would develop your film into a stack of printed photos you would pick up in a pack later that day. Kodak and Fujifilm cameras were popular, and disposable cameras were the easy option because they had the film built in, which means that you could just take the camera to the store's photo department without having to risk ruining the film while taking it out of the camera. Polaroid cameras were expensive, but gave you instantly developed photos, which back then seemed like voodoo magic. And if you wanted to record a video, you had to buy a camcorder along with either mini DV tapes or recordable VHS tapes, depending on the size and quality of the camcorder. The camcorder is how America's Funniest Home Videos existed. Today, clock apps enable you to view current times and locations anywhere in the world, set alarms and timers, and use your phone as a stopwatch. Here's a photo of my dorm room desk in college in 2010. At the bottom left is an old alarm clock handed down from my mom. It showed only the time you set it to, it enabled you to set an alarm, and the top of it even played CDs. Imagine that, a device that does more than just one thing. Even though this photo is from 2010, the alarm clock shown was outdated even back then because it's more of an example of how time was kept back in the 1990s. As for stopwatches, back in the 90s, you either had to buy a dedicated handheld stopwatch or buy a digital wristwatch that had a stopwatch feature built into it. And of course, if you used a timer back then, it probably looked like this. I imagine most of us today don't use compass apps since maps apps exist. And when I was growing up, people generally didn't use traditional compasses either. But some kids had them basically as toys, which was their only practical use considering that most people in the past probably several hundred years have had a general idea of what direction north is. Aside from my own, I don't have any phone numbers memorized in my head today. This is much different than when I was growing up. In the 90s, I simultaneously kept the phone numbers of several relatives and several friends memorized in my head. This was common, and it usually began with writing the number down on a piece of paper when a person gives you her or his phone number. If you had a designated spot for this phone number, it was often inside an address book some referred to as the Little Black Book, which was the 90s version of contacts.
Girl, tell me that was not Eddie's Little Black Book. Oh, it sure was. Wait till he sees all his ex-girlfriends at his birthday party.
Most other numbers could be found in a much larger book called a phone book. There's no one-to-one 90s equivalent to the FaceTime app because video calls just weren't a thing. In the 1995 Simpsons episode titled Lisa's Wedding, the episode depicts what was then considered a futuristic version of video calls in 2010. As for files, back in the 90s, those were stored in old-school filing cabinets. Nothing fancy here. There also were no apps to help us find missing items either. If you lost something, that something could be gone for a while because the only way to find it was through brute force of lifting things up and looking underneath. I'm pretty sure back in the 90s, those who kept track of their fitness probably just kept a physical journal with a pen or pencil to document their progress after each workout. If you wanted heart rate data, you just put your finger on your pulse while staring at a clock. If you wanted a guided workout without hiring a personal trainer, then you needed to rent or buy a workout video on VHS and do the workout in front of your TV and VCR. Brainstorming was either done using a pen or pencil and paper, using a board that sticky notes can be pinned to, or using a whiteboard or chalkboard.
Like this, I need a barmaid to seal off this section right here. Okay, when you get over to Sweet Red Rose.
Before health apps, we carried physical health ID cards. Tracking steps probably wasn't a thing. The best thing one could do was roughly track the distance or time spent walking or running. Any kind of sleep analysis probably had to be done in a lab. Things like heart rate data, cycle tracking, and weight would have had to be journaled using pen and paper. Hospital records would be kept by your doctor, but I imagine you could have printed copies if you requested them. In fact, I entered middle school at the end of the decade, and I remember vaccination records being required. The 90s equivalent of a home app is the collection of remote controllers that operated different things in the house. The main one, of course, was the TV remote, but a 90s home may have also had remotes for the VCR and the ceiling fan. iTunes and other digital marketplaces for media had their 1990s equivalents in stores that sold physical media. Tower Records is probably the closest 90s version of the all-in-one media store since it was primarily known for selling cassettes, CDs, and vinyl from its collection of music, but some locations also had additional separate floors for selling video cassettes, books, and video games. As much as Blockbuster Video and Hollywood Video are remembered for their respective places in movie rental history, I don't recall any major video store chains growing up. It seemed like every video store in the 90s was a mom and pop shop that operated in a strip mall. Of course, quite a few independent music stores existed too, as well as local chains like Rasputin Music that operated in the Bay Area and in fact still do in Berkeley. So there are locations where you can still experience what it felt like to shop for music back in the 90s. Before journaling apps, there were pens, pencils, and journaling notebooks. Before magnifier apps, there were physical magnifying glasses. As for mail apps, email was a thing in the 90s. Remember this?
You got mail.
The difference between email then and email today was that receiving an email was exciting in the 90s, whereas today my Gmail inboxes have over 5,100 combined unread messages, and my Yahoo inboxes have over 21,000 combined unread messages. Ah yes. What would the world do without Maps apps? In the 90s, it was common for people to have stacks of physical maps in the glove compartments of their cars. Maps often unfolded open and folded closed. And they were usually either fixed city maps, fixed state maps, fixed nation maps, or fixed world maps. There was no using fingers to zoom. Atlases were also a thing. They were just books filled with maps of subregions within regions. If you wanted to know how to get from point A to point B, you already had to know where point A and point B were on the map. Before measuring apps, we used the good old-fashioned tape measure. I'm sure most of you still do, but I just thought it would be funny to throw this one in here. Before modern messaging apps, AOL Instant Messenger was popular beginning in the late 90s. Sure, you had to be sitting in front of your computer to do it, but it felt advanced for its time, probably because of this. The time waiting for dial-up internet to connect, as well as the time it took to load any basic web page, made AOL Instant Messenger feel that much cooler because it seemed like the only data capable of moving across the web instantly. By the 1990s, vinyl was a thing of the past, so the 90s was a cassette and CD era of music. Even though CDs were supposedly more advanced than cassettes, CDs didn't allow you to skip to a part of the song you like, whereas cassettes enabled you to rewind and fast forward them to any part of the song. I often recorded my favorite radio songs onto cassettes. To do this, you had to put a cassette tape into the stereo, turn that stereo onto a local radio station, wait for that radio station to play one of the songs you wanted to record, press the record button when the song comes on, and then press the stop button when the song ends. It was easier when the radio station host told you what the upcoming song was going to be, but I found that rarely happened, so for best results you needed to be familiar with how the opening split second of your favorite song sounded. I know that CD burning was a popular way of copying music onto CDs, but I didn't have CDs until the 2000s, so CD burning was mostly something I overheard my friends talk about. Either way, if you wanted to listen to music on the go, you needed to carry a portable cassette player or a portable CD player with you along with extra batteries to sub in when the old ones get drained. Portable music devices and accessories could be found in many stores, but Radio Shack was a particularly popular place to find those things. The last Radio Shack I saw was during my college days in Berkeley in the early 2010s. This is what the building looks like as of these 2022 Google Maps images. In the 90s, if you were someone like me who didn't follow artists but instead had favorite songs from various artists, you usually had to buy the entire album those singles came with. Your best chance of optimizing the number of songs you'd enjoy on an album was to buy a compilation album like Now That's What I Call Music.
18 chart-topping hits, all in one mind-blowing collection!
Hit me, baby, one more time.
In the 90s, the three common ways of getting news were newspapers, watching the news at one of the specific times it came on, or word of mouth. Before notes apps, we took notes using basically any writing utensils and paper we could find, but notebooks and sticky notes were the most common. The most common phone was a landline phone at home with a cord connecting the phone to the wall. Most people didn't have caller ID, so unless you were expecting a specific call, the phone ringing from your kitchen could have been from anyone. My childhood years may have been the last era when prank calling was possible.
Hey, is there a butts here? See more butts? Hey, everybody, I want to see more butts!
Some people had cell phones, but they weren't common, so I imagine the types of girls in Clueless are among the few who had them. Many people had pagers, which were also called beepers. Some of them were sophisticated enough to receive messages on a screen or even return messages. But some pagers had no screen at all and only beeped or vibrated, and you were somehow supposed to just know what that meant. Admittedly, when I was a kid, I thought those things were pretty useless, but I was a kid, so maybe I was missing something.
Ugh, as if!
Payphones were common. As a kid, you instinctively checked the little door to see if a coin was sitting there because sometimes there was. Once in a blue moon, I will still encounter an old payphone in the real world, and it feels like finding a fossil. Collect calls were also common, and there were many collect call commercials promoting 1-800-COLLECT.
1-800-COLLECT!
Apparently 1-800-COLLECT is still in service as of the making of this video. After getting developed at a local store's photo department, photos often lived within physical photo albums with sleeves to protect and preserve the prints. This storage method was common for other visual media such as trading cards, though some people collected CDs in clear sleeved books as well. The 90s equivalent of saving memes and images online would be to take scissors and cut images directly out of magazines and newspapers. The closest 90s equivalent to podcast would be a radio show, but a television show wouldn't be much different. Before reminders apps, reminders had to be written down, but my elders often just asked me to remember things for them. Now let's talk about web browsing. I was first introduced to the internet sometime in the mid-90s during a visit to the computer lab at my elementary school. In the world of search engines, Google existed, but I'm pretty sure Yahoo was more popular. Yeah, I know, the 90s were weird. In the world of browsers, the legendary Internet Explorer was common, as was Netscape. Speaking of Netscape, let's talk about the company that purchased them. That's right. No one who lived through those times could forget the unavoidable free trial CDs that AOL bombarded the public with to great success. Before translator apps, you had to buy a translation book or audio tape for one specific language. Before TV apps, you needed to have a traditional television at home with physical TV guides if you didn't have cable. Today you can upload credit cards to wallet apps and then use your smartphone to pay for items at many places. In the 90s, with one exception, everything was cash or card that came from a physical wallet people kept almost everything in, unless they had purses they also kept everything in. The exception to cash or card? Standing in line behind someone writing a check. Also, food stamps in the 90s were much closer to actual stamps compared to the swipeable cards used for modern government assistance. Of course, weather apps didn't exist in the 90s. To get the weather forecast in the 90s, you either checked the weather page of the newspaper, or you waited for the weather segment on your local news. For those who grew up in areas where snow is possible, you probably also had to watch the local news or listen to a local radio station to find out if and which local schools were closed that day.
And listen carefully, schools are officially closed for a snow day.
In the area of California I grew up in, snow days were virtually impossible, but there was a remote chance of a flood day if enough roads were affected. In kindergarten and first grade, I wasn't that into sports. In kindergarten, everyone on the playground played soccer, so I just casually played that during recess. When I transferred elementary schools at the beginning of first grade, it was common to play basketball on the playground while pretending to be either Michael Jordan or Shaq, naturally, because in 1993, those were the two biggest basketball stars. Until second grade, I still wasn't that into sports, but then Disney released this. Yes, the aforementioned Angels in the Outfield from the movie chapter makes its way back into the discussion, because it gave me what I'll call my official gateway into the wonderful world of sports. At the end of the following school year, another movie completed my immersion into the sports world.
Come on and slam, and welcome to the jam.
I'm sure I wasn't the only kid whose basketball and/or Michael Jordan obsession began with Space Jam. Michael Jordan was the face of the sports world in the 90s, so much so that every brand and trend associated with him became wildly popular, whether it was the Chicago Bulls, Nike shoes, longer shorts, or the bald head. Everyone wanted to... I grew up between the homes of the Sacramento Kings and the Golden State Warriors, yet the playgrounds were dominated by Jordan, Pippen, and Rodman jerseys with the occasional Shaq or Penny jersey. The 1990s had its share of dynasties that produced the next generation of bandwagon fandom. The NBA had the Bulls, Major League Baseball had the New York Yankees, and the NFL had the Dallas Cowboys, though thankfully growing up in the region of the Cowboys' biggest rivals mitigated the number of Cowboys fans I had to grow up around.
And Davis will score for the 49ers.
I would characterize 1990s sports as a decade of two trends that fed into one another: expansion teams and experimental artsy uniforms. Between 1988 and 1995, the NBA brought in 6 new teams, which included the Charlotte Hornets with their legendary 90s warm-up jackets, and the Toronto Raptors with their legendary 90s jerseys that sported a dribbling raptor. The NHL expanded by 7 teams in the 90s, which included 2 California teams that brought in their own respective iconic branding: the San Jose Sharks in 1991, and the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim in 1993. Yes, the Mighty Ducks, now called the Ducks, is an actual team founded by Disney due to the success of their 1992 film, The Mighty Ducks. During the 90s, the NFL added 2 teams, and Major League Baseball added 4, which included one that irritated me personally in the Arizona Diamondbacks because they got good really fast and were the bane of the Giants' existence in the late 90s.
And the Arizona Diamondbacks are the champions in the National League West.
But expansion team or not, just look at some of those jersey styles throughout North American Major League sports in the 90s. And I know some of you want me to mention the original USA Dream Team, which I am right now, but truthfully I was a bit too young to have experienced them in that moment, so I have to limit them to merely an honorable mention for me not personally remembering their impact on the zeitgeist at the time. I am, however, old enough to remember the early days of athletes/sports entertainers who would go on to become legends.
And I can be a good role model for children,
I guess hello world, huh?
First tournament as a professional, Tiger Woods.
There's gonna be the man right there. With a fucking idea. Unbelievable agility, yes sir. I can't believe it. What a way to make your debut.
Kobe Bryant makes his regular season debut in purple and gold.
This time, how about a spin?
Music in the 1990s is such an intimidating subject to cover in a single chapter that I'm going to selfishly focus on my favorites from the decade because getting to every important artist or trend would be impossible. And like the other subjects, I'm going to begin with 1992 since I'm not old enough to have formed many permanent memories before that year. In the world of Raymond, radio in the early 1990s was dominated by 2 female solo artists who both made their official public debuts in 1990, and a male group that made its official public debut in 1991. By the time I started kindergarten, I had been on countless car rides with my mom when Mariah Carey songs played on the radio.
I had a vision of love.
We could also count on Celine Dion's voice making an appearance. Her cover of Patti LaBelle's If You Ask Me To is still to this day the single most nostalgic stimulus that instantly takes me back to kindergarten. Similarly, there are a couple of Boyz II Men songs that instantly take me back to first grade, like End of the Road. For this 90s music chapter, I'll define the mid-90s to be from 1994 to 1996. This period still had a lot of Mariah Carey, Celine Dion, and Boyz II Men, but this period brought an influx of movie soundtracks that became instant classics regardless of the quality of movies they were attached to.
Can you paint with all the colors of the wind?
The Lion King soundtrack is the first movie soundtrack I fell in love with.
There's a calm surrender.
It made me understand why even in the 1990s, my mom was still listening to Elton John songs from her childhood. The Batman Forever soundtrack was another good one. Kiss from a Rose by Seal is the soundtrack's most famous song, which is probably why it became a regular top 40 radio song.
The light on the dark side of me.
And of course there was this soundtrack. One might argue that the Space Jam soundtrack is as famous as the movie itself, and most of the songs fit seamlessly into the themes of the movie. This mid-90s era is also when Brandy hit the scene, and I mention her because her hit song, Sittin' Up in My Room, may have been my first ever favorite song. And as long as I'm talking about the mid-90s, I'm going to give an honorable mention to Selena. Because why not? Bring it. Now it's time to get jiggy with the late 90s, because 1997 to 1999 was a fascinating period of music. This was Will Smith's breaking away from sitcom star and movie and music megastar years. His movies were popular, his songs were popular, and he was often the one responsible for the hit songs on soundtracks for movies he starred in. Speaking of soundtracks, as I mentioned in the movie chapter, there was one that no one who lived through 1997 could escape from.
Wherever you are.
With the exception of that song coming from an A-list artist, My Heart Will Go On fits a trend from that year that I've noticed in retrospect. 1997 was the year of instant classics from artists who I couldn't name another song from if my life depended on it. Originally, I included a joke here about irony that I removed because it was too cringy when I rewatched it. But then I discovered real irony when I realized the song my joke referred to didn't even come out in 1997 like I thought when I wrote this script.
It's like rain.
If Alanis Morissette singing an entire song about irony seems silly, imagine making an entire piece of media about the life of a doll.
Life in plastic, it's fantastic.
In addition to Aqua's Barbie Girl, your 90s radio probably fed you plenty of Natalie and Bruglia's Torn,
I'm all out of faith. This is how I feel.
and Hanson's Bop. Speaking of groups, 1997, yes, we're still talking about that year, saw the emergence of both hit girl groups and hit boy groups. On the ladies' side, there was TLC, Destiny's Child, and of course, Spice Girls, to name a few. I will caveat the inclusion of Spice Girls here by mentioning that they did have a huge 1996, but their cultural relevance stayed at its peak through 1997 and into 1998 before one of the group members left.
If you wanna be my lover, you gotta get with my friends. Make it.
On the men's side, there was Light Funky Ones, aka LFO, NSYNC, and Backstreet Boys, to name a few. The male groups peaked in 1999, and most of their hits instantly take me back to the beginning of middle school. I Want It That Way by Backstreet Boys seems to have made a resurgence in the 2020s as a popular karaoke song.
I want it that way.
Another music trend that seemed to peak in the late 90s was the rise of Latin pop stars. If I hear a song from that period by Enrique Iglesias, Jennifer Lopez, Ricky Martin, Christina Aguilera, or Mark Anthony, I could get instant PTSD from middle school. To conclude the late 90s, I need to give a mention to Monica. I couldn't fit her neatly into the flow of an earlier part of this chapter, but she produced enough hits toward the end of the decade to earn a mention. Angel of mine. I know I could have covered way more 90s music, but I needed to stop somewhere so I could move on to the fashion chapter. I'm not particularly passionate about fashion, and since I spent the majority of the 90s locked in the chambers of elementary school classrooms, 90s fashion didn't make that much of an impression on me. So I googled 90s fashion to jog my memory, and we're just going to blitz through these. In the left column we have slip dresses, which appear throughout all of the several 90s fashion articles I came across during my lazy research. Then there are colored sunglasses, which I vaguely remember celebrities wearing. I don't remember bomber jackets, but I do remember scrunchies, which just about every girl at school had. Board shorts were a thing, and I somewhat remember bucket hats being a part of pop culture at the time. I don't remember corsets because I was in elementary school, which of course limited my exposure to anyone who would wear one. And of course leather jackets were popular. In the middle column you have flannel, which I distinctly remember the John Goodman character wearing on Roseanne even though I never watched the show. Leopard print, plaid skirts, track shoes, and boat shoes are all trends I don't remember well due to limited exposure, but I remember cargo pants. And of course being a grade school student growing up in small conservative towns limited my exposure to crop shirts, so I don't remember those. And I don't remember quilted coats either. See people, this is the award-winning fashion journalism you're all here for. Anyway, let's struggle through the rest of these. So the last column has overalls, which I definitely remember being a thing both at school and in pop culture. I don't remember bike shorts, probably because elementary school. Ripped jeans were definitely a thing, whether intentional or not. As a lifelong 49ers fan, I definitely remember the bandana trend. Bra tops I of course don't remember because elementary school. Chain wallets were apparently a thing, though I don't remember seeing those until being exposed to punk rock kids in middle school. And of course, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson might be the biggest reason that almost everyone knows fanny packs were a thing in the 90s. I don't remember striped sweaters being a trend, but apparently they were. Some 90s fashion items not listed in those search results that I came across. Baggy jeans, because, of course. Graphic tees were popular. They had everything from band names to sports logos, but I vaguely remember controversial Bart Simpson's t-shirts being popular for a second.
What's your name, son?
Well, I'm Bart Simpson. Who the hell are you?
Hoop earrings I definitely remember. Those were popular throughout pop culture, but especially in black pop culture. And the goth look became popular in the mid to late 90s, and I definitely remember this trend continuing into the 2000s. Regarding female hair trends in the 90s, pixie cuts were popular, the Rachel cut was trendy, and many girls and women tried the bob cut at least once. I also remember Alice bands, which seemingly every girl at school had. For male hairstyles, there was curtained hair, which I associate with the mid-90s, mullets, which was definitely more of an early 90s thing. Ponytails were popular among men with long hair. On the opposite end of long hair, the Raymond style, better known as bald, was popular, especially among athletes, and especially among pro basketball players, likely due to the popularity of anything associated with Michael Jordan. Flat tops were popular even though I always thought they looked kind of silly. High top fades were just as silly to me, though occasionally the person wearing it had enough swag in other areas to make up for it. Spiky hair was one of those styles that could somehow be both silly and cool at the same time, which is a sign of a trend that is distinctly a product of its time, like basically any trend from the 1970s. And of course we can't talk about the 90s without talking about bleached hair. This was definitely one of the more challenging scripts I ever wrote because how do you even talk about a decade? There were so many categories to cover and I could only cover them from my perspective as I remembered them, and everyone's experience was different. So I know this video barely scratches the surface, even though it took me a year to make. But I hope it was worth it, and I hope you enjoyed going down memory lane with me.
5, 4,